Hey, you'll hate what you'll discover about me, but it's too late. I can't make myself send you away anymore, the Duke warned the young cook in the silent pre-dawn kitchen. Before dawn, the kitchen of the mansion remained shrouded in silence and cold. The ancient stones held the dampness of night, and the low fire barely illuminated the copper pots. Rosalinda kept her hands busy so they wouldn't tremble. She had been taken from the Valencia market days before, when her family's debt had been paid with coins too heavy to refuse. Now, she was a cook in a house where silence carried weight and fear learned to hide. The journey from the market to this place had been a blur of dust and dread. Don Fernando's grip on her arm still burned in her memory. The way his fingers had dug into her flesh. The way his breath had stunk of wine and desperation as he announced to anyone who would listen that he had a girl to sell. A girl who could cook, clean, work until her bones turned to powder. A girl whose father's debts had become her inheritance. Rosalinda had not wept. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury the poor could not afford. Instead, she had fixed her eyes on a distant point beyond the marketplace crowd and waited for her fate to be decided by men who saw her as nothing more than currency. The manor had appeared through the morning, mist like something from an old tale, the kind her mother used to whisper before the candles guttered out. Stone walls that seemed to breathe with age. Windows that watched like hollow eyes. Gardens that had once been beautiful but now grew wild with neglect, as though the very earth had forgotten it was meant to bloom. Alonso Vargas, the steward who had paid for her with the Duke's coin, had spoken little during the ride. His instructions came in clipped sentences, each one a warning wrapped in courtesy. Do not look the Duke in the eye. Do not ask questions about the family. Do not, under any circumstances, approach the East Corridor, the one with the door that remains locked. The Duke is not a cruel man, Alonso had said, though his voice suggested otherwise. But he's not a kind one either. He is something in between, something that even I, after 15 years, do not fully understand. Rosalinda had nodded, filing away each rule like a card in a deck she would need to play carefully. She understood survival. She had practiced it her entire life. The kitchen became her domain by default. The previous cook had left 3 weeks prior, fled in the night, according to the whispered gossip of the chambermaids. Before her, there had been another, and another before that. 15 women in 5 years, Rosalinda would later learn. 15 women who had entered this house and found reasons to leave it. She was the 16th. On her first night, she explored the kitchen by candlelight. The hearth was massive, built for banquets that no longer occurred. The pantry held provisions for a household of 50, though fewer than 10 servants remained. Everything spoke of a grandeur abandoned, a life interrupted and never resumed. It was the fire that troubled her most. When she knelt to stoke the flames, her hands began to shake. Not from cold, from something older. Something that lived in the orange glow and the crackling wood and the way smoke could fill a room before you even noticed it was there. Her father's face flickered in the flames, and she had to close her eyes and count her breaths before she could continue. You are stronger than the fire, she whispered to herself, the words her mother had taught her. You command it. It does not command you. But some nights, she was not certain that was true. She did not sleep well in her small room near the kitchen. The walls were thick, but sound traveled strangely in old houses. She heard footsteps at odd hours, heavy, deliberate, then suddenly stopping. She heard what might have been murmuring, though she could not make out words. And once, just before dawn, she heard something that sounded almost like weeping, though it was gone so quickly she convinced herself she had dreamed it. On the third morning, she rose before the sun and began preparing bread. The rhythm of kneading soothed her, the push and fold, the warmth of the dough beneath her palms. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not hear the footsteps until they stopped at the kitchen door. She looked up, and there he was. Alexander de Illinois stood in the doorway like a shadow displaced from the world. Tall, still, his dark hair fell across a face that might have been handsome once, before grief had carved its lines too deep. But it was his eyes that held her, amber, like honey touched by firelight, carrying the weight of nights that never seemed to end. He did not speak immediately. He studied her as one might study a document written in an unfamiliar language, with suspicion, with curiosity, with something that flickered too quickly to name. "You're the new one," he said finally. His voice was low, roughened by disuse. Rosalinda straightened her spine. "I am. Look at me." The command cut through the kitchen air. She remembered Alonso's warning. Do not look the Duke in the eye. But the Duke himself was ordering otherwise. She lifted her gaze to meet his and held it there, though something in her chest tightened with the effort. He tilted his head, a ghost of surprise crossing his features. The others looked away, or cried, or both. "I'm not the others." "No," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Perhaps not." He stepped into the kitchen, and the space seemed to shrink around him. "You are the 16th woman to stand in this kitchen in 5 years. 15 before you. Some lasted weeks. Some lasted days. One lasted 4 hours before she ran screaming into the night." A bitter smile touched his lips. "How long do you imagine you will endure?" Rosalinda's hands had stopped their work. The dough waited, patient and silent, while she measured her words. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, "and I have survived worse than a large house and a difficult master." Something shifted in his amber eyes, a flicker of what might have been respect, or might have been pain, or might have been simply the recognition of one wounded creature by another. "You don't know what I am," he said. "No, but I will learn." He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Rosalinda saw what Alonso had been unable to describe. The Duke was not cruel, not truly, but he was broken in a way that made cruelty easy, a way that built walls out of sharp words and isolation out of fear. "If you stay," Alexander said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you will come to hate what you discover about me." It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a confession. And yet, even as he spoke the words, even as his eyes hardened again into their habitual coldness, Rosalinda sensed that he could not bring himself to send her away. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. She returned to her bread, her hands finding their rhythm once more. "Then I will stay," she said simply, "and see what I discover." The Duke watched her for a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the faint scent of old books and sleepless nights. Rosalinda's hands trembled slightly as she shaped the dough, but she did not stop. She had made her choice. The days that followed established a rhythm Rosalinda learned to navigate with careful precision. She rose before dawn, coaxed the fire to life despite the trembling in her hands, and prepared meals carried to parts of the house she had not yet seen. The Duke did not appear in the kitchen again, not for several days, but his presence permeated every stone, every shadow, every whispered conversation that stopped when she entered a room. Teresa, the eldest chambermaid, became her reluctant guide to the household's unwritten rules. A stout woman in her 50s with hands roughened by decades of labor and eyes that had learned to see everything while appearing to notice nothing. "The Duke takes his meals in the library," Teresa explained on Rosalinda's 4th morning. "Breakfast at 7, though he rarely eats more than bread and tea. Dinner at 8, though some nights he forgets entirely. You prepare the trays. Alonso, or I will carry them." "Why can't I carry them myself?" Teresa's expression tightened. "Because new servants have a way of disturbing him." Rosalinda thought of amber eyes holding libraries of unspoken grief. "He did not seem disturbed when he spoke to me." "He spoke to you?" Genuine surprise crossed Teresa's weathered features. "On your 3rd day?" "He asked how long I would last." The older woman was quiet, her hands frozen mid-fold. "He has not come to the kitchen in 2 years. Not since." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Do your work, keep your head down, and do not ask questions about things that are not your concern." But Rosalinda had never been skilled at leaving questions unasked. She noticed that Alonso carried keys at his belt, and one, older and more ornate, was never used in her presence. She noticed the east corridor remained dark, its door firmly shut. She noticed servants spoke of the Duke in hushed tones, referring to events obliquely before the tragedy After the fire. Fire. The word snagged in her mind like a thorn. Each morning, when she knelt before the hearth, she forced herself to breathe slowly. The memories came anyway. Her father's workshop filled with smoke, her mother's screams, flames painting everything in shades of orange and terror. She had been 12. She remembered every detail with the crystalline clarity trauma bestows upon its survivors. The smell of burning wood, the heat that singed her eyebrows and left a small scar on her wrist. Her father's voice calling out, then stopping. They never found his body. A week into her employment, the Duke summoned her. Alonso delivered the message with visible reluctance. He wishes to see you in the library. Immediately. The library occupied the entire north wing of the second floor. When Alonso opened the heavy oak doors, Rosalinda's breath caught. Books, thousands upon thousands, climbing from floor to ceiling on shelves that wrapped around the room like a wooden cathedral. Ladders on brass rails reached the highest volumes. Stained glass filtered morning light into pools of amber and rose. Alexander de Illinois sat in the center of it all. He looked different in daylight. Less a shadow, more a man carved from exhaustion. He wore only a white shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, and Rosalinda noticed scars tracing along his left forearm. Burns, old ones, healed imperfectly. He was watching her study him. You stare, he observed. You have scars. I have many things. He gestured to a chair. Sit. She sat, forcing herself not to look at the fire crackling in the hearth. Alonso tells me you have been asking questions, the Duke said. His voice was calm, but something coiled beneath the words. I have been trying to understand the household. There is a difference between understanding the household and understanding its master. Which do you seek? Rosalinda considered lying. But something about this man demanded honesty. Both. I cannot serve a house I do not understand. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. You are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone almost before it appeared. You will take over the care of this library. The books require dusting, organizing. You will come each afternoon after your kitchen duties. I am a cook, Your Grace, not a librarian. You are whatever I require you to be. Can you read? Spanish, Latin, some French. Then you're more qualified than anyone else here. Rosalinda paused at the door. The 15th woman. Why did she leave? Silence stretched between them. Because she saw something she could not unsee, Alexander said quietly. And she did not have the courage to stay. I am not easily frightened. His voice was barely a whisper. We shall see. The library became Rosalinda's second world. Each afternoon, after the kitchen work was done and the evening meal prepared, she climbed the stone stairs to the north wing and lost herself among the books. The Duke had given her no specific instructions beyond the general mandate to organize and care for the collection, so she invented her own system, cataloging volumes by language, then by subject, then by the condition of their bindings. It was meditative work, and she found herself grateful for it. The silence of the library was different from the silence of the rest of the house. Here, the quiet felt inhabited, filled with the whispered voices of 1,000 authors, the accumulated wisdom and folly of centuries pressed between leather covers. She could breathe here in a way she could not breathe elsewhere. Alexander came and went unpredictably. Some days he was absent entirely, locked away in rooms she had no permission to enter. Other days he appeared without warning, settling into his chair by the window and watching her work with those amber eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. At first, they did not speak. He read or wrote or simply stared at the stained glass while she moved quietly among the shelves. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, a strange ritual began to form. That volume belongs with the philosophical texts, he said one afternoon, his voice cutting through the dusty silence. Rosalinda looked at the book in her hands, a treatise on astronomy. It discusses the movement of celestial bodies. I placed it with the sciences. The author was a monk who believed the stars were windows into the mind of God. Philosophy. She considered arguing, but something in his tone suggested he was not truly correcting her. He was engaging. Testing. perhaps even enjoying the exchange. Then your collection requires a new category, she said. Philosophy disguised as science. The corner of his mouth twitched. And where would you shelve the reverse? Science disguised as philosophy. Next to it, of course. They would have much to discuss. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Rosalinda returned to her work, but she felt something shift in the air between them. A thread of connection, fragile as spider silk, beginning to form. The rituals multiplied. She learned that he took his tea with honey, but refused to admit he had a preference. She learned that he read late into the night, burning through candles at a rate that concerned the household accounts. She learned that certain books, a shelf near the eastern window, were never to be touched, their spines facing inward as though hiding from the world. She did not ask about those books. Not yet, but she asked about others. This edition of Cervantes, she said one evening, holding up a volume worn nearly to pieces. It has been read so many times the binding has failed. Alexander did not look up from his writing. It was a gift. From whom? The scratch of his pen stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, and Rosalinda knew she had ventured too close to something guarded. From someone who is gone, he said finally. His voice was flat, emptied of emotion in a way that suggested emotion too vast to contain. Rosalinda set the book down gently. I can repair it, if you wish. He looked at her then, something flickering in his amber gaze, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude he did not know how to express. You know bookbinding? My father taught me. Before, she stopped, her own memories rising unbidden. Before he was gone as well. The words hung between them, two griefs recognizing each other across the distance of a room. Alexander held her gaze for a long moment, and Rosalinda saw something crack in the mask he wore so carefully. Repair it, he said quietly, but do not alter it. Every mark, every tear, they remain. She understood. The damage was part of the story. That night, she began work on the Cervantes volume, carefully stitching the pages back into their binding with thread she had requested from Teresa. The work was slow and precise, requiring focus that pushed everything else from her mind. When she finally looked up, she realized Alexander had moved from his desk to a chair much closer to where she worked. He was watching her hands, something unguarded in his expression. You have steady hands, he observed. They were not always steady. She thought of the kitchen hearth, of mornings spent forcing herself to breathe through the fear. I taught them to be. Ow! The question was simple, but she sensed the weight behind it. A man searching for something he could not name. Repetition, she said. Doing the thing that frightens you until it no longer holds power. Until it becomes simply something you do. Alexander was silent, his eyes dropping to his own scarred forearm. In the candlelight, the burns looked older, more settled. Wounds that had healed on the surface, but perhaps still festered beneath. And if the thing that frightens you is yourself? He asked, his voice barely audible. Rosalinda set down her needle and met his gaze directly. Then you learn yourself. Slowly, until you're no longer a stranger in your own skin. He looked at her as though she had spoken in a language he had forgotten he knew. Then, without another word, he rose and left the library, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Rosalinda returned to her work, her heart beating strangely in her chest. She was beginning to understand this broken man, and that understanding, she sensed, would change everything. The games began without warning. Rosalinda arrived at the library one afternoon to find her careful organization undone. Books she had shelved by subject were scattered across tables. Volumes she had repaired lay open, their pages exposed to dust. At first, she thought an intruder had violated the space, but then she noticed the pattern. Each displaced book was one she had touched with particular care. Each disruption was precise, deliberate. Alexander sat in his usual chair, watching her survey the chaos. You moved them, she said. Not a question. I wanted to see how you would react. Anger flickered in her chest, but she held it carefully, like a flame she could not afford to let spread. And what did you hope to learn? Whether you would weep, shout, flee, His amber eyes studied her face with unsettling intensity. The others did, eventually, when they understood that nothing they built here was safe for me. Rosalinda set down her things and began, methodically, to return the books to their places. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice did not waver. Then you will have to find another way to break me, Your Grace. I do not shatter so easily. Something shifted in his expression, not quite admiration, but close to it. He watched her work in silence for nearly an hour before speaking again. You are stubborn. I prefer persistent. It will serve you poorly in this house. Rosalinda shelved the last volume and turned to face him. Or perhaps it will serve me better than anything else. The games continued. He would dismiss her work with cruel indifference one day, then praise some small detail the next. The way she had positioned a reading lamp, the specific order of volumes on a high shelf. He granted her privileges no other servant enjoyed. Permission to borrow books, access to the library at any hour, the right to sit in his presence without explicit invitation. Then, without explanation, he would revoke them. She learned not to react. When he offered warmth, she accepted it without expectation. When he withdrew, she continued her work as though nothing had changed. This consistency seemed to unsettle him more than any defiance could have. "Why do you stay?" he demanded one evening, his voice sharp with frustration. Rosalinda looked up from the book she was repairing. A collection of poetry with a dedication inscribed on the first page in a woman's elegant hand. "For my Alexander, who taught me that words could be bridges." She had not asked about the inscription, though its presence burned with unanswered questions. "Because I gave you my word." Words mean nothing. People leave. They always leave. Not everyone. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You know nothing about me. Nothing about what I have done, what I have lost, what I am capable of." Rosalinda set down her tools. "Then tell me." The challenge hung in the air between them. Alexander's face went pale, then flushed with something between anger and fear. For a moment, she thought he would order her out, or worse. Instead, he turned toward the window, presenting her with the rigid line of his back. "My wife gave me that book," he said quietly. "Isabel. She wrote that dedication the year we married. She believed words could heal anything." A pause, heavy with unspoken weight. She was wrong. Rosalinda waited, barely breathing. "We had 3 daughters. Sophia, the eldest, serious and thoughtful, always with a book in her hands. Nina, the middle child, wild as a spring storm, impossible to contain. And Beatrice, the youngest, barely 4 years old, who laughed more than she spoke." His voice had changed, softened into something almost tender. Rosalinda felt her heart contract. 5 years ago, there was a fire in the stables. The horses panicked. The girls, he stopped, his shoulders rigid. They had gone to see a new foal. Isabel went to find them when the smoke began. The silence stretched, terrible and complete. "I ran into the flames," Alexander continued, his voice hollow now. "I searched until my clothes burned and my skin melted, and someone, Alonso, I think, dragged me out against my will. I survived." The word fell like a stone. They did not. Rosalinda's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. Not for herself. For him. For the family reduced to ash and memory. For the man who had lived when everyone he loved had not. "The doctors said I was fortunate. The scars would heal. I would walk again, use my hands again, live again." His laugh was devoid of humor, as though living was something to celebrate, as though I deserved to continue when they... He could not finish. His hand pressed against the window glass, and Rosalinda saw it trembling. She rose from her chair and crossed the room slowly, giving him time to stop her if he wished. He did not move. When she stood beside him, close enough to touch, but maintaining the distance he seemed to require, she spoke quietly. "My father died in a fire when I was 12. I watched our home burn and could do nothing to save him. For years, I could not look at flames without feeling that I was burning too." Alexander turned his head slightly, his amber eyes red-rimmed and raw. "The kitchen hearth," he said. "Each morning. You force yourself to light it." She nodded. "Each morning. Because the fire does not own me. And the past, however terrible, does not own you either. He stared at her for a long moment. This woman who had seen his carefully constructed walls and refused to be intimidated by them. This woman who carried her own grief like a quiet companion and still found the strength to stand before his. "You should hate me," he whispered, "for how I have treated you. For the games. Perhaps." Rosalinda held his gaze. "But hatred requires energy I would rather spend on healing. Yours and mine." Something broke in Alexander's expression, not dramatically, but like ice beginning to crack at the edges of a frozen lake. He did not speak. He did not reach for her. But when she returned to her work, he remained by the window, and his silence was no longer a weapon. It was a beginning. The weeks that followed Alexander's confession settled into something Rosalinda had not expected, a fragile peace. The games did not cease entirely. He was too broken for sudden transformation, but their edges softened. When he dismissed her work now, there was hesitation in his voice. When he withdrew into silence, he sometimes returned with small gestures that spoke louder than apologies. A book left on her work table marked at a passage he thought she might appreciate. A cup of tea prepared by his own hands, waiting for her when she arrived at the library. Once, a single winter rose from the neglected garden, its stem wrapped in cloth to protect her fingers from thorns. He never acknowledged these offerings. If she thanked him, he would frown and change the subject. But Rosalinda understood the language he was learning to speak, the vocabulary of someone who had forgotten how to be gentle and was teaching himself again, one uncertain gesture at a time. The household noticed the change, though no one dared comment openly. Teresa observed the softening of the Duke's orders, the way his voice lost its sharpest edges when addressing the servants. Alonso watched Rosalinda carry trays to the library herself now, a privilege previously unthinkable. The younger maids whispered among themselves, weaving theories about the new cook who had somehow survived where 15 others had failed. But survival, Rosalinda was learning, came with its own weight. The nightmares visited her without warning. She would wake in her small room near the kitchen, her heart racing, her father's voice still echoing in her ears. Sometimes she could return to sleep. Other nights, she rose and walked the dark corridors, letting the cold stone beneath her feet anchor her to the present. It was during one of these midnight wanderings that she first heard Alexander's nightmares. The sound came from somewhere above, a cry muffled by walls, but unmistakable in its anguish. She followed it without thinking, climbing stairs she had never climbed at this hour, passing doors she had been told never to approach. The east corridor stretched before her, darker than the rest of the house, and at its end stood a door slightly ajar. She should not enter. Every rule, every warning, every instinct told her to turn back. But the sounds coming from within, broken syllables, names repeated like prayers, the thrashing of someone fighting demons only he could see, pulled her forward. The room beyond was sparse. A bed, a chair, a window with curtains drawn tight against the moon. Alexander lay tangled in sheets damp with sweat, his scarred arm flung across his face, his lips forming words she could barely hear. "Sophia, Nina, I'm coming. And then, louder, torn from somewhere deeper, "Isabel." Rosalinda moved to the bedside without conscious decision. She did not touch him. Instinct warned her that waking him violently might cause more harm. Instead, she spoke his name, quietly at first, then with growing steadiness. "Alexander. Alexander, you are dreaming. You are safe." His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing. For a terrible moment, he did not recognize her, or anything. He was still in a fire, still running through smoke and flame, still reaching for hands that had already turned to ash. Then, slowly, the present reasserted itself. His breathing slowed. His eyes focused on her face, and confusion replaced the terror. "Rosalinda?" His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "What are you? How did you?" "I heard you." She kept her voice calm, free of judgment. "From downstairs. I came." He sat up slowly, running a trembling hand through sweat-dampened hair. The vulnerability in his expression was almost unbearable. This man who wore authority like armor, stripped bare by his own sleeping mind. "You should not be here," he said, but there was no force behind the words. "This corridor, this room—" "I know." Rosalinda remained where she stood, neither advancing nor retreating. "But you were suffering, and I could not walk away from that." Alexander stared at her, as though she were some creature from myth, impossible, inexplicable. "The others would have fled. They would have been afraid. I am not the others." He laughed weakly, echoing her words from weeks before. "No, you are not." Silence settled between them, different from the silences they had shared in the library. This was intimate in a way that daylight could not permit. Two people stripped of their careful masks by the honesty of darkness. "The nightmares come every night," Alexander admitted quietly. "Since the fire. Sometimes I can control them. Sometimes—" He gestured at the tangled sheets, the evidence of his thrashing. "Sometimes I cannot." "What do you see?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold. But Rosalinda had learned that this man responded to directness where gentleness might fail. "The stables. The flames. Their faces," his voice cracked. "I hear them calling for me, and I run. But no matter how fast I run, I cannot reach them. I'm always too late." Rosalinda sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining enough distance to respect his boundaries while closing enough to offer presence. "The dream lies to you. You ran into the fire. You nearly died trying to save them. Being too late is not the same as not trying. It feels the same. I know." She thought of her own father, of the helplessness that had paralyzed her 12-year-old body while their home burned. "I know it does." They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. Alexander's breathing steadied, and some of the tension left his shoulders. He looked at her with something new in his amber eyes, not gratitude exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement of a shared wound. "You should go," he said finally. "If the servants find you here, let them." Rosalinda rose, but she did not move toward the door. "I will not pretend this did not happen, and neither should you." She left him then, returning to her room through corridors that felt less menacing than before. Something had shifted between them, some barrier had fallen. She did not know what would come next, whether he would withdraw again, rebuild his walls, pretend the night had never occurred. But when she arrived at the library the following afternoon, Alexander was waiting for her, and in his hands was a cup of tea, prepared exactly as she preferred it, offered without a word but with eyes that said everything his voice could not. The tea became ritual. Each afternoon, when Rosalinda climbed the stairs to the library, a cup waited for her on the small table beside her workstation. Always prepared the same way, strong, with a touch of honey and a slice of dried orange peel she had once mentioned reminded her of her mother's kitchen in Valencia. Alexander never acknowledged the gesture. He would be reading or writing when she arrived, his attention fixed elsewhere, as though the tea had materialized through some domestic magic that had nothing to do with him. But she knew, and he knew she knew, and in that unspoken understanding, something tender took root. The nights changed too. Rosalinda did not return to Alexander's room uninvited. That boundary remained, but she began leaving small things outside his door. A sachet of lavender to ease sleep. A cup of chamomile tea, still warm, placed on a tray with a cloth to keep it covered. A note once, just 3 words, "You are not alone." She never saw him collect these offerings, but they were always gone by morning, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the sound from the east corridor were quieter than before. Alonso noticed the change first. "You have done something to him," he said one evening, catching Rosalinda in the corridor outside the kitchen. His tone was not accusatory, but there was wonder in it, and perhaps a trace of fear. "I have done nothing but my work." "No." Alonso shook his head slowly. "It is more than that. He takes his meals now. All of them. He has not thrown a cup in weeks. Yesterday, I heard him." He stopped, as though the words were too strange to speak aloud. "Heard him what?" "Humming. A melody from somewhere. I have not heard music in this house since." He did not finish. He did not need to. Rosalinda absorbed this information quietly. She had noticed the changes too, the way Alexander's eyes lingered on her now without the sharp edge of suspicion, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. but she was careful not to name what was growing between them, not even to herself. Names had power. Names created expectations. And this fragile thing they were building could not yet bear the weight of definition. The library became their shared sanctuary. Rosalinda continued her work of organizing and repairing the collection, and Alexander continued his habit of watching her. But the watching had changed. Where once he had studied her like a problem to be solved, now he observed her like something precious and unexpected, a gift he did not quite believe he deserved. They talked more freely now. She told him about Valencia, the cramped apartment above her father's workshop, the smell of leather and glue that had permeated her childhood, the way her mother sang while cooking and her father laughed at jokes only he understood. She told him about the fire that had taken everything, about the years of poverty that followed, about the debt that had led her to Don Fernando's grasp and ultimately to this house. "You have suffered," Alexander said one evening, his voice heavy with something like guilt. "And I have added to that suffering with my cruelty." "You have added to it," Rosalinda agreed. She would not lie to him. That was not the foundation they were building. "But you have also given me something I did not expect." "What?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "Purpose. A place where my pain is not invisible. A person who understands what it means to carry grief like a second heartbeat." Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I do not deserve your forgiveness." "Perhaps not. But forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing to set down a burden that no longer serves." She met his eyes. "I am choosing. For myself, not for you." He looked away, but not before she saw the moisture gathering in his amber gaze. Spring crept into the valley slowly, thawing the frozen gardens and coaxing green from branches that had seemed permanently bare. Rosalinda began taking her morning walks outside, breathing air that tasted of renewal and possibility. Sometimes Alexander joined her, not walking beside her, but appearing at a distance, a dark figure against the brightening landscape, watching her as though afraid she might disappear if he looked away. One morning, she found him standing at the edge of the garden, staring at a plot of earth that had been turned but not planted. "Isabel's roses grew here," he said without turning. "She tended them herself. After the fire, ordered them all cut down. I could not bear to see them bloom when she—" His voice broke. Rosalinda moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "They could grow again," she said softly, "if you allowed it. I do not know if I can. You do not have to know. You only have to try." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Not hope exactly, but the shadow of hope, the possibility of its return. "Will you help me?" he asked, and the question carried weight far beyond roses. Rosalinda took his scarred hand in hers. The skin was rough, puckered with old burns, but warm with life. She felt him tense at the contact, then slowly, carefully relax. "Yes," she said, "I will help you." They stood together in the garden as the sun climbed higher, two broken people holding hands amid the memory of flowers, beginning to believe that beauty might grow from ash. The roses came from a village nursery 3 days' ride from the manor. Alexander had sent Alonso with specific instructions, varieties that bloomed in deep red and soft pink, the same colors Isabel had favored. When the plants arrived, wrapped in damp cloth to protect their roots, Rosalinda found Alexander standing in the garden at dawn, staring at them as though they were ghosts made flesh. "I do not know if I can do this," he said without looking at her. Rosalinda knelt beside the first hole they had dug together the previous day. "Then we will do it slowly, one rose at a time." They worked in silence for most of that morning. Alexander's hands trembled as he handled the plants, whether from the physical memory of flames or the emotional weight of what they represented. Rosalinda could not say. But he did not stop. Each time his fingers faltered, he would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and continue. She did not rush him. She did not offer comfort he had not requested. She simply worked beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his remembering. By midday, 6 roses stood in the dark earth, their bare branches reaching toward a sky heavy with coming rain. Isabel would have laughed at me, Alexander said quietly, brushing dirt from his scarred hands. I was hopeless with plants. She would guide my hands, show me where to cut, when to water. I killed more roses than I saved. But you tried. I tried because she asked me to. Because seeing her happy, his voice caught. There was nothing I would not do to see her happy. Rosalinda sat back on her heels, studying his profile. The grief was still there, carved into every line of his face, but something else was emerging alongside it, a softness she had glimpsed only in fragments before. Tell me about her, she said. Not the tragedy, the life before. Alexander was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. We met at a summer festival when I was 22. She was the daughter of a minor nobleman, beneath my station, according to my father. I did not care. She had this way of seeing through pretense, of finding the truth beneath the surface. The first time we spoke, she told me I seemed like a man wearing a costume of himself. A faint smile crossed his lips. She was right. He talked for hours about their courtship, conducted in secret until his father's death freed him to marry as he chose. About their wedding, small and intimate, held in the chapel that still stood at the edge of the estate. About the birth of each daughter, Sophia arriving during a thunderstorm, Nina refusing to sleep through the night for 2 full years, Beatrice born laughing. According to the midwife, though Alexander suspected that was exaggeration. Rosalinda listened without interruption, letting his words wash over her like water over parched earth. She understood what he was doing, not just remembering but reclaiming. For 5 years, his family had existed only in the context of their death. Now, tentatively, he was allowing them to live again in memory. Beatrice loved the horses, he said, his voice growing rough. She was too young to ride alone, but she would spend hours in the stables, talking to them as though they could understand. The night of the fire, she had gone to see the new foal. Nina followed her. She always followed, always had to be part of everything. And Sophia went to bring them back for dinner. He stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabel saw the smoke first. She ran before I could stop her. I tried to follow, but the flames, his hands clenched in the dirt. By the time I reached the stable, the roof was collapsing. I could hear them inside. I could hear Alexander. Rosalinda's voice was gentle but firm. You do not have to continue. I do. He looked at her, and his eyes were red but dry. I have never spoken of this. Not fully. The doctors asked, the priests asked, but I could not. He shook his head. You are the first person I have wanted to tell. The weight of that trust settled over Rosalinda like a mantle. She reached out and covered his dirt-stained hand with her own. Then tell me, all of it, and when you are finished, we will plant the rest of the roses together. He told her, the screams that haunted his dreams. The moment when the beam fell and he knew with terrible certainty, that he would not reach them in time. The hands that dragged him back, Alonso's voice shouting that he would die too if he did not stop. The weeks of fever that followed, his body fighting to survive while his mind begged for oblivion. When he finished, the sun had moved across the sky and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Rosalinda did not speak. There were no words adequate to what he had shared. Instead, she rose, pulled him gently to his feet, and led him to the remaining roses. They planted the last 4 together as the rain fell around them, soaking their clothes and mixing with the tears neither of them acknowledged. When the final rose was in the ground, Alexander stood motionless, staring at the garden that was no longer empty. They will bloom, Rosalinda said softly. In time, Alexander turned to face her. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and water ran down his scarred cheeks like the tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 5 years. You should not have stayed, he whispered. You should have run like all the others. But I did not. No. He raised one trembling hand to her face, his fingers brushing her cheek with impossible gentleness. No, you did not. They stood there in the rain, 2 broken people surrounded by roses that had yet to bloom, and for the first time in 5 years, Alexander allowed himself to believe that survival might not be a punishment. It might be a beginning. The touch in the garden changed everything. In the days that followed, Rosalinda felt Alexander's gaze on her with new intensity. It was no longer the watchful scrutiny of a man waiting for betrayal. It was something hungrier, more vulnerable. When their hands brushed while reaching for the same book, he did not pull away. When she spoke, he leaned closer, as though her voice were a melody he was trying to memorize. The household noticed. Teresa began setting an extra place at the servants' table, then quietly removing it when Rosalinda failed to appear for meals. Alonso's knowing glances followed her through the corridors. The younger maids whispered with renewed vigor, their theories growing bolder by the day. Rosalinda ignored them all. What existed between her and Alexander had no name yet, and she would not let others define it before they could. But naming became harder to avoid when Alexander began seeking her out beyond the library. He appeared in the kitchen one morning while she was kneading bread, his presence so unexpected that she nearly dropped the dough. He said nothing, simply sat in the corner, watching her work with an expression she could not read. "You will make the servants talk," she said without turning. "Let them. Your reputation is already ruined." There was dark humor in his voice. The mad duke who drove away 15 women, who speaks to no one, who haunts his own house like a ghost. What more can they say? Rosalinda turned to face him, flour dusting her arms. "They can say you have taken an interest in your cook. Have I?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Rosalinda held his gaze, refusing to look away. "You tell me." Alexander rose and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, the faint lines of sleeplessness that still marked his face. "I have not felt anything in 5 years," he said quietly. "I thought that part of me had burned with them. But when I see you—" He stopped, struggling for words. "You make me remember that I am still alive, and I do not know whether to thank you or curse you for it." Rosalinda's heart pounded in her chest. "And what do you feel?" "Terror." The word came out raw. "Because if I allow myself to feel more and then lose you, you assume you will lose me. I lose everyone." She reached up, her flour-dusted hand cupping his scarred cheek. He flinched at the contact, but did not pull away. "I am not easily lost," she said. "I thought you had learned that by now." Something broke in his expression. The last wall, the final barrier he had been clinging to. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I am afraid, Rosalinda." "I know." She stroked his cheek gently. "So am I." They stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of rising bread and the warmth of the hearth, 2 people trembling on the edge of something neither had expected to find. That evening, Alexander did not eat in the library. For the first time in 5 years, he joined the servants' table. The silence that fell when he entered the kitchen was absolute. Teresa froze mid-sentence. Alonso rose from his chair, uncertain whether to bow or flee. The younger maid stared with open mouths. "Sit," Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority of habit, even as uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "I did not come to disrupt your meal." He took the empty chair beside Rosalinda, the one Teresa had been setting and removing for weeks. The servants exchanged glances, but slowly, hesitantly, returned to their food. The meal passed in awkward fragments. Conversation stuttered and stalled, unable to find its rhythm with the Duke present. But Alexander made no demands. He ate quietly, his shoulder nearly touching Rosalinda's, his presence a statement that required no words. When the meal ended, he rose and addressed the table. "This house has been silent for too long," he said. "I have been silent for too long. That will change." He looked at each face in turn. Teresa's guarded hope, Alonso's cautious optimism, the maid's lingering fear. "I cannot undo what I have been, but I can choose what I become. And I choose," his voice faltered. He glanced at Rosalinda, drawing strength from her steady gaze. "I choose to try." He left without waiting for a response. The servants sat in stunned silence until Teresa finally spoke. "Well," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that is the most words he has spoken at once in 5 years." Alonso shook his head slowly. "What have you done to him?" he asked Rosalinda. She looked at the empty doorway where Alexander had stood. "Nothing he was not already capable of. I simply reminded him." That night, Rosalinda found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was elegant but unsteady, the letters formed by a hand and used to writing such things. Asterisk, meet me in the garden at midnight. There is something I must show you. Asterisk. She should have refused. Midnight meetings with the master of the house courted scandal and danger in equal measure. But she had stopped making safe choices the moment she crossed the threshold of this house. At midnight, she wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped through corridors now familiar. The garden was silver with moonlight, the new roses casting long shadows across the freshly turned earth. Alexander stood at the far edge, near a gate she had never noticed before. "You came," he said. "Did you doubt I would? I doubt everything. It is my nature." He gestured toward the gate. "But tonight I am trying to trust." He led her through the gate and down a path overgrown with weeds. The moonlight barely penetrated here, and Rosalinda had to follow close behind him, her hand finding his in the darkness. They emerged into a clearing, and Rosalinda gasped. A chapel stood before them, small and ancient, its stone walls wrapped in ivy. Stained glass windows caught the moonlight and transformed it into pools of color on the ground. It was beautiful and forgotten, a sacred space reclaimed by time. "This is where we married," Alexander said quietly. "Isabel and I. The household has not tended it since." He did not need to finish. "I have not been able to enter." Rosalinda understood. But tonight, he turned to face her, and in the moonlight his eyes shone with something between fear and hope. "Tonight I want to try. With you." She took his hand more firmly in hers. Then we entered together. The chapel door groaned as Alexander pushed it open, the sound echoing through the clearing like a voice long silenced, finally permitted to speak. Dust motes swirled in the moonlight that streamed through the stained glass, painting the stone floor in fragments of blue and gold and crimson. Rosalinda stepped inside first, giving Alexander the space to follow at his own pace. The interior was small, perhaps 20 pews, an altar draped in cloth now gray with neglect, candelabras thick with melted wax that had hardened into frozen cascades. Despite the abandonment, there was beauty here, the kind of beauty that persists through decay, that refuses to be entirely consumed by time. Alexander stood in the doorway, his silhouette rigid against the moonlit garden behind him. His breathing had grown shallow, and Rosalinda could see his hands trembling at his sides. "You do not have to enter," she said softly. "Standing at the threshold is enough." "No." His voice was strained but determined. "I have stood at threshold for 5 years. Tonight I cross." He stepped inside. The sound of his footsteps on the stone floor seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He moved slowly, his eyes traveling over every surface. The pews where guests had once sat, the windows Isabel had chosen herself, the altar where they had spoken vows neither imagined would end so soon. She wore white, he said, his voice distant with memory. Her mother's dress, altered to fit her. She said it was impractical, white in a country house, surrounded by gardens and horses. But she wanted to honor tradition. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. She was always balancing those things, the practical and the beautiful. Rosalinda remained silent, letting him speak. Sophia was not yet born, but Isabel was already. He touched his stomach, indicating pregnancy. "We married quickly, before it became obvious. Not for shame, we felt no shame, but because my father's family would have used it against us." Against her. He walked to the altar, his fingers brushing the dusty cloth. "I promised her everything that day. Protection, devotion, a life filled with more joy than sorrow." His voice cracked. "I failed every promise." "You did not fail," Rosalinda said, moving to stand beside him. "Promises cannot account for tragedy. You loved her. You loved your daughters. That love was not a failure. Then why does it feel like one?" The question hung in the sacred air, unanswerable and raw. Rosalinda did not attempt to answer it. Some griefs had no resolution. They could only be carried, their weight redistributed but never fully lifted. Instead, she took his hand and led him to the front pew. They sat together in the moonlit chapel, surrounded by dust and memory, and she let the silence hold them. After a long moment, Alexander spoke again. I have not prayed since the fire. I could not. What God allows children to burn? What faith survives such cruelty? Perhaps faith is not about understanding, Rosalinda said carefully. Perhaps it is about choosing to continue despite the absence of understanding. Do you believe that? She considered the question honestly. I do not know what I believe. My father's death shattered something in me that has never fully healed. But I have learned that demanding answers from the universe leads only to bitterness. I choose instead to find meaning in what remains. Alexander turned to look at her, his amber eyes luminous in the stained glass light. And what remains for you? My hands. She held them up, studying her own palms. The skill my father taught me. The ability to create, to repair, to nourish. My memories of him. Not the fire, but the years before. His laughter. His patience. The way he would sing off key while working and pretend not to notice when I laughed at him. She lowered her hands and met his gaze. And now this. You. This house. The unexpected gift of being needed by someone who needed me to stay. Alexander's breath caught. You speak of me as a gift. Are you not? You have given me purpose when I had none. Shelter when I had nowhere else to go. And she hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. And the chance to know someone who understands what it means to survive when survival feels like punishment. He was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hands in his. I brought you here tonight because I wanted you to see this place, to understand what it meant to me and what it means that I can finally enter it again. His thumbs traced circles on her palms, gentle and deliberate. But I also brought you here because I need to ask you something. Rosalinda's heart quickened. Ask. I am broken, Rosalinda, damaged in ways that may never fully heal. I will have nightmares. I will have days when the grief consumes me and I cannot see beyond it. I will fail you in moments when you deserve better. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, soft, reverent, achingly tender. But if you will have me, not as master to servant, but as something more, something I do not yet have the courage to name, I will spend whatever years remain to me trying to deserve you. Tears gathered in Rosalinda's eyes, blurring the colored light around them into a wash of beauty. You speak as though I am whole, she whispered, as though I do not carry my own fractures, my own fears, my own nights when the darkness feels endless. Then we are matched. His voice was rough with emotion. Two broken people, finding pieces of themselves in each other. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, breathing in the scent of him, with smoke and old books and something beneath that was simply Alexander. I will have you, she said, not because you are healed, but because you are healing, not because you are worthy, but because worthiness is not the measure of love. Alexander pulled back to look at her, wonder and disbelief warring in his expression. Love, he repeated, as though testing the word. Is that not what this is? He did not answer with words. Instead, he cupped her face in his scarred hands and kissed her, gently at first. Then, with growing urgency, 5 years of loneliness and grief pouring into a single point of connection. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, the moonlight had shifted. The stained glass painted new patterns on the floor, and the chapel seemed somehow warmer than before. I thought I would never feel this again, Alexander said, his voice shaking. I thought I had buried this capacity alongside them. It was never buried. Rosalinda touched his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her palm. Only dormant, waiting for permission to wake. They remained in the chapel until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. They did not speak much. Words seemed inadequate after what had passed between them. But when they finally rose to leave, Alexander paused at the altar. I will restore this place, he said quietly, not to forget what it was, but to honor it. And perhaps, he glanced at Rosalinda, something cautious and hopeful in his eyes. perhaps to give it new meaning. She took his hand as they walked back through the overgrown path, through the garden where roses were beginning to bud, toward a house that no longer felt haunted. The past could not be undone. The grief would never fully fade. But love, Rosalinda was learning, did not require the absence of sorrow. It only required the courage to bloom despite it. The news spread through the household like fire through dry grass. Teresa was the first to know, or rather, the first to confirm what she had long suspected. She found them in the garden at dawn, sitting side by side on a stone bench, Rosalinda's head resting on Alexander's shoulder while he read aloud from a volume of poetry. The image was so domestic, so impossibly tender, that Teresa stopped mid-stride, her basket of herbs forgotten in her hands. Alexander looked up and met her gaze. Teresa braced for dismissal, for the sharp command to return to her duties and speak of what she had seen to no one. Instead, the Duke simply nodded, a small acknowledgement, permission granted without words. Teresa nodded back and retreated, her heart lighter than it had been in years. By evening, the entire household knew. The maids whispered with excitement rather than fear. Alonso permitted himself a rare smile. Even the gardener, a taciturn man who had survived the Duke's worst years through strategic invisibility, was seen humming as he tended the new rose beds. But with hope came complication. "You understand what this means," Alonso said to Rosalinda 2 days later, catching her alone in the corridor outside the library. "What people will say. I understand. He is a duke. You are. A cook. A servant. A woman of no title and no fortune." Rosalinda's voice was calm but firm. "I know what I am, Alonso. I know what he is. But what exists between us does not require the world's approval." Alonso studied her for a long moment. "You truly love him." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "I do." "Then I pray you are strong enough for what comes next. The world outside these walls will not be kind." He was right, of course. Word traveled, as word always did. The Duke of Valderas, the mad recluse who had not left his estate in 5 years, had taken a lover. Not a noblewoman, not a widow of appropriate standing, but his cook, a woman who had arrived at his door seeking employment and somehow found her way into his bed. The letters began arriving within weeks. Some came from distant relatives Alexander had not seen since Isabel's funeral, suddenly concerned about his welfare, his reputation, the family name. Others came from neighboring estates, their curiosity thinly veiled as social courtesy. A few were openly hostile, warning Alexander of fortune hunters and scheming servants who preyed on grieving men. He read each letter in Rosalinda's presence, his jaw tightening with every line. "They know nothing," he said, crumpling a particularly vicious missive from a cousin he had always despised. "They did not come when Isabel died. They did not come when I was burning alive, when the doctor said I might never walk again. But now, they have opinions. They will always have opinions." Rosalinda took the crumpled letter from his hand and smoothed it flat. "The question is whether their opinions hold power over us. They should not." But Alexander was silent. She knew him well enough now to read the conflict in his features, the desire to shield her warring with the ingrained awareness of social consequence. "If I marry you," he said slowly, "you become Duchess of Valderas. You will be scrutinized, judged, found wanting by people who have never worked a day in their privileged lives. They will call you names I cannot repeat. They will exclude you from society, mock you behind your back, and some," his voice hardened, "some will try to harm you directly." Rosalinda absorbed this without flinching. "And if you do not marry me, then you remain my mistress in the eyes of the world, protected by my wealth but not my name, free to leave if the burden becomes too great. Is that what you want? For me to be free to leave?" He looked at her then, and his amber eyes held nothing but truth. "I want you to be free to choose. Whatever you choose, I will accept, but I will not trap you in a cage of my making, however gilded." Rosalinda rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. She knelt before him, taking his scarred hands in hers, and looked up into the face of the man she had come to love despite every obstacle. "I have been trapped before," she said quietly, "by poverty. by circumstance, by a debt I did not choose and a master who saw me as property. I know what a cage feels like, Alexander. And this, she gestured at the room around them, at the life they were building together. This is not a cage. This is the first freedom I have known since my father died. Tears gathered in his eyes. You would marry me, knowing what it will cost you. I would marry you knowing that the cost is irrelevant. What matters is what we build together. What matters is that I wake each morning beside someone who sees me, truly sees me, and loves what he sees. Alexander pulled her up and into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of years of loneliness finally ending. Then we will marry, he said against her hair. Let them talk. Let them judge. Let them send their letters and their whispers. We have survived worse than social disapproval. Much worse, Rosalinda agreed, smiling against his chest. The wedding was announced a month later. The household threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy. Teresa took command of the kitchen, determined that the wedding feast would rival any noble celebration. Alonso coordinated the grounds, hiring additional help to restore gardens that had languished for years. Even the taciturn gardener contributed, coaxing the new roses into early bloom through methods he refused to explain. The guest list was small by noble standards, a deliberate choice. Alexander invited only those who had shown genuine care during his years of grief. A childhood friend who had written letters even when they went unanswered, a physician who had treated his burns with compassion rather than morbid curiosity, a priest from the village who had offered prayers without demanding attendance. Rosalinda invited no one. She had no family left, no friends from her former life worth reclaiming. But she did not feel the absence as keenly as she once might have. The household had become her family now. Teresa's maternal fussing, Alonso's quiet support, the maid's excited whispers. She had built something new from the ashes of what she had lost. The night before the wedding, Alexander led her once again to the chapel. It was transformed. The dust had been swept away, the pews polished, the altar draped in fresh white cloth. New candles stood in the restored candelabras, their flames casting warm light across walls that had known only darkness for 5 years. The stained glass gleamed, cleaned of years of neglect, and the colors seemed more vibrant than ever. You did this, Rosalinda breathed. We did this. Alexander stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. This is where Isabel and I married. I thought I could never enter here again, never allow it to hold new memories. But you showed me that honoring the past does not mean being imprisoned by it. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw not the haunted man who had greeted her that first day, but someone transformed, still scarred, still grieving, but no longer broken. Tomorrow, we will speak our vows in this place. We will begin our life together where my first life began and ended. And I will carry Isabel and our daughters with me, not as chains, but as blessings, because loving them taught me how to love you. Rosalinda reached up and traced the line of his jaw, feeling the familiar roughness of scar tissue beneath her fingers. And I will carry my father with me, his memory, his teachings, his belief that love was the only thing worth surviving for. She smiled through the tears that blurred her vision. He would have liked you, I think. Once he got past the brooding, Alexander laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, the sound echoing through the chapel like a benediction. I suspect he would have threatened me first. Any father worth his salt would, undoubtedly, but he would have seen what I see. A good man, buried beneath his pain, waiting for permission to live again. They stood together in the candlelit chapel, the past surrounding them like a gentle presence rather than a haunting one. Tomorrow, they would marry. Tomorrow, their new life would begin. But tonight, they simply held each other, two survivors finding peace in the improbable gift of each other's arms. The news spread through the household like fire through dry grass. Teresa was the first to know, or rather, the first to confirm what she had long suspected. She found them in the garden at dawn, sitting side by side on a stone bench, Rosalinda's head resting on Alexander's shoulder while he read aloud from a volume of poetry. The image was so domestic, so impossibly tender, that Teresa stopped mid-stride, her basket of herbs forgotten in her hands. Alexander looked up and met her gaze. Teresa braced for dismissal, for the sharp command to return to her duties and speak of what she had seen to no one. Instead, the Duke simply nodded, a small acknowledgement, permission granted without words. Teresa nodded back and retreated, her heart lighter than it had been in years. By evening, the entire household knew. The maids whispered with excitement rather than fear. Alonso permitted himself a rare smile. Even the gardener, a taciturn man who had survived the Duke's worst years through strategic invisibility, was seen humming as he tended the new rose beds. But with hope came complication. "You understand what this means," Alonso said to Rosalinda 2 days later, catching her alone in the corridor outside the library. "What people will say. I understand. He is a duke. You are a cook, a servant, a woman of no title and no fortune." Rosalinda's voice was calm but firm. "I know what I am, Alonso. I know what he is. But what exists between us does not require the world's approval." Alonso studied her for a long moment. "You truly love him." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "I do." "Then I pray you are strong enough for what comes next. The world outside these walls will not be kind." He was right, of course. Word traveled, as word always did. The Duke of Valderas, the mad recluse who had not left his estate in 5 years, had taken a lover. Not a noblewoman, not a widow of appropriate standing, but his cook, a woman who had arrived at his door seeking employment and somehow found her way into his bed. The letters began arriving within weeks. Some came from distant relatives Alexander had not seen since Isabel's funeral, suddenly concerned about his welfare, his reputation, the family name. Others came from neighboring estates, their curiosity thinly veiled as social courtesy. A few were openly hostile, warning Alexander of fortune hunters and scheming servants who preyed on grieving men. He read each letter in Rosalinda's presence, his jaw tightening with every line. "They know nothing," he said, crumpling a particularly vicious missive from a cousin he had always despised. "They did not come when Isabel died. They did not come when I was burning alive, when the doctor said I might never walk again. But now, they have opinions. They will always have opinions." Rosalinda took the crumpled letter from his hand and smoothed it flat. "The question is whether their opinions hold power over us. They should not." But Alexander was silent. She knew him well enough now to read the conflict in his features, the desire to shield her warring with the ingrained awareness of social consequence. "If I marry you," he said slowly, "you become Duchess of Valderas. You will be scrutinized, judged, found wanting by people who have never worked a day in their privileged lives. They will call you names I cannot repeat. They will exclude you from society, mock you behind your back, and some," his voice hardened, "some will try to harm you directly." Rosalinda absorbed this without flinching. "And if you do not marry me, then you remain my mistress in the eyes of the world, protected by my wealth but not my name, free to leave if the burden becomes too great. Is that what you want? For me to be free to leave?" He looked at her then, and his amber eyes held nothing but truth. "I want you to be free to choose. Whatever you choose, I will accept, but I will not trap you in a cage of my making, however gilded." Rosalinda rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. She knelt before him, taking his scarred hands in hers, and looked up into the face of the man she had come to love despite every obstacle. "I have been trapped before," she said quietly, "by poverty, by circumstance, by a debt I did not choose, and a master who saw me as property. I know what a cage feels like, Alexander. And this," she gestured at the room around them, at the life they were building together. "This is not a cage. This is the first freedom I have known since my father died." Tears gathered in his eyes. "You would marry me, knowing what it will cost you?" "I would marry you knowing that the cost is irrelevant. What matters is what we build together. What matters is that I wake each morning beside someone who sees me, truly sees me, and loves what he sees." Alexander pulled her up and into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of years of loneliness finally ending. "Then we will marry," he said against her hair. "Let them talk. Let them judge. Let them send their letters and their whispers. We have survived worse than social disapproval. Much worse, Rosalinda agreed, smiling against his chest. The wedding was announced a month later. The household threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy. Teresa took command of the kitchen, determined that the wedding feast would rival any noble celebration. Alonso coordinated the grounds, hiring additional help to restore gardens that had languished for years. Even the taciturn gardener contributed, coaxing the new roses into early bloom through methods he refused to explain. The guest list was small by noble standards, a deliberate choice. Alexander invited only those who had shown genuine care during his years of grief. A childhood friend who had written letters even when they went unanswered, a physician who had treated his burns with compassion rather than morbid curiosity, a priest from the village who had offered prayers without demanding attendance. Rosalinda invited no one. She had no family left, no friends from her former life worth reclaiming. But she did not feel the absence as keenly as she once might have. The household had become her family now. Teresa's maternal fussing, Alonso's quiet support, the maid's excited whispers. She had built something new from the ashes of what she had lost. The night before the wedding, Alexander led her once again to the chapel. It was transformed. The dust had been swept away, the pews polished, the altar draped in fresh white cloth. New candles stood in the restored candelabras, their flames casting warm light across walls that had known only darkness for 5 years. The stained glass gleamed, cleaned of years of neglect, and the colors seemed more vibrant than ever. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden. Rosalinda woke before sunrise, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. In a few hours, she would become the Duchess of Valderas, a title so far removed from her origins that it still felt like something from a fever dream. The girl who had kneaded bread in a cramped Valencia kitchen, who had scrubbed floors and mended clothes and counted coins to survive, would stand before God and witnesses and pledge her life to a duke. Teresa appeared at her door before the first light had fully broken, carrying a bundle wrapped in white cloth. "The master had this made for you," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He wanted it to be a surprise. Rosalinda unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside lay a wedding dress of ivory silk, simple in its lines but exquisite in its craftsmanship. Delicate embroidery traced the bodice. Roses, she realized, their petals stitched in thread so fine it seemed to shimmer. At the hem, more roses climbed upward, as though reaching toward the sun. He remembered. Rosalinda whispered, "I told him once that my mother embroidered roses on everything she made." He remembered. Teresa helped her dress, her weathered hands gentle as they fastened buttons and smoothed fabric. When Rosalinda finally stood before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman who looked back was not a servant, not a cook, not a survivor clinging to the edges of existence. She was someone transformed, someone loved. "You are beautiful," Teresa said, her voice thick. "The master is a fortunate man. We are both fortunate." Rosalinda took the older woman's hands. "And I have not forgotten who helped me survive those first weeks. Your kindness kept me standing when I wanted to flee." Teresa blinked rapidly, clearing the moisture from her eyes. "You kept yourself standing, child. I merely provided the tea." They laughed together, the sound cutting through the gravity of the moment. And then it was time. The walk to the chapel felt longer than Rosalinda remembered. The household staff lined the path through the garden, their faces bright with emotion. The roses Alexander and Rosalinda had planted together were in full bloom now, deep reds and soft pinks nodding in the morning breeze, their fragrance perfuming the air like a blessing. Alonso waited at the chapel door, dressed in his finest clothes. He offered his arm with a formal bow. "The master asked if I would escort you," he said quietly. "In the absence of your father, I hope I am an acceptable substitute." Rosalinda's eyes stung. "More than acceptable. You have been a steady presence in this house since the moment I arrived. I can think of no one I would rather have beside me." Together, they entered the chapel. The interior glowed with candlelight, hundreds of flames dancing in the restored candelabras and along every windowsill. The stained glass transformed the morning sun into rivers of color that pooled on the stone floor. Flowers from the garden filled every available surface. Roses, of course, but also wildflowers Teresa had gathered at dawn, their humble beauty a counterpoint to the elegance of the setting. And at the altar stood Alexander. He wore black, as he always did, but there was nothing funereal about his appearance today. He stood straight and tall, his scarred hands clasped before him, his amber eyes fixed on the doorway. When Rosalindo appeared, those eyes widened, not with surprise, but with wonder, as though he was seeing something miraculous he had not dared to hope for. The priest spoke words that Rosalinda barely heard. Her entire being was focused on Alexander, his face, his voice, the slight tremor in his hands as he took hers. When the moment came for vows, he spoke first. I, Alexander Mendoza, Duke of Valderas, take you, Rosalinda, as my wife. Not because tradition demands it, not because society expects it, but because you have given me something I thought I had lost forever, the courage to live. His voice cracked, but he pressed on. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to stand beside you through whatever storms may come. I promise to remember that love is not the absence of grief, but the willingness to feel joy despite it. And I promise, he paused, steadying himself, I promise to spend the rest of my days proving worthy of the gift you have given me simply by staying. Rosalinda's tears fell freely now, tracking down her cheeks like the rain that had fallen the day they planted roses together. I, Rosalinda, take you, Alexander, as my husband. Not because you are titled, not because you have wealth, but because you saw me when I was invisible. You offer me a place when I had none. You trusted me with your grief, and in doing so, you taught me that brokenness is not weakness. It is the proof of survival. She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from their warmth. I promise to stand beside you in the darkness and the light. I promise to tend the garden of our life together, pulling weeds when they appear and nurturing what grows. And I promise to love you, not the man you were before the fire, not the man the world expects you to be, but the man you are now, scars and all. The priest pronounced them married. Alexander kissed her then, not the hesitant brush of lips they had shared before, but something deeper, a seal upon the promises they had made. The small gathering of guests applauded, their joy echoing off the chapel walls. When they emerged into the sunlight, hand in hand, the household staff showered them with rose petals. The fragments of color drifted down like confetti from heaven, catching in Rosalinda's hair and settling on Alexander's shoulders. My wife, he said, the words carrying wonder. My duchess. My husband, she replied, smiling. My duke. They walked together through the garden, past the roses they had planted, toward the house that was no longer haunted by grief alone. Behind them, the chapel bells began to ring. Restored by Alonso's careful work, silent for 5 years, but singing now, announcing to anyone within earshot that something had changed in the house of Valderas. That love had returned. That hope had been reborn. The wedding feast lasted until evening. Teresa had outdone herself, producing a spread that rivaled anything Rosalinda had seen in her years of service. Roasted meats glistening with herbs, fresh bread still warm from the oven, vegetables from the estate's gardens prepared in a dozen different ways. Wine flowed freely, and even Alexander, who had barely eaten for years, filled his plate twice. The servants ate alongside the guests, another break from tradition that Alexander had insisted upon. They are family, he had said when Rosalinda questioned the arrangement. They stayed when others fled. They deserve to celebrate with us. As the sun set and the candles were lit, Alexander rose from his seat and raised his glass. 5 years ago, I stood in the ruins of everything I loved and wished for death. The fire that took my family should have taken me as well, and for a long time, I resented that it had not. He looked around the room, at the faces watching him with varying degrees of emotion. But tonight, I stand in a different place. Not because the grief has ended, it never will, but because I have learned that survival is not punishment. It is opportunity. The chance to love again, to build again, to find beauty in the ashes of what was lost. He turned to Rosalinda, and his voice softened. To my wife, who saw a monster and chose to see a man instead, who stayed when 15 others fled, who taught me that the heart, like a garden, can be restored with patience and care. He raised his glass higher. To Rosalinda, my salvation, my home. The guests echoed the toast, their voices filling the room with warmth. Rosalinda rose and took Alexander's hand. To those we have lost, she said quietly, Isabel, Sophia, Nina, Beatrice, and my father Miguel. They are not forgotten. They are carried with us, woven into the fabric of who we have become. We honor them not with endless mourning, but with the courage to continue loving despite our fear of loss. She raised her own glass. To the future, whatever it holds. To the future, the room repeated. And in the candlelight, surrounded by people who had witnessed their impossible journey from isolation to union, Alexander and Rosalinda sealed the toast with a kiss. The night was young. Their life together had just begun. The first months of marriage unfolded like a dream Rosalinda had never dared to imagine. She woke each morning in the vast bed of the master chambers, Alexander's arm draped across her waist, his breath warm against her neck. The nightmares still came for him. She had learned to recognize the signs, the sudden tension in his body, the murmured names of those he had lost, but now she was there to anchor him, to whisper him back to the present. You stayed, he would say each time, wonder coloring his voice. I will always stay, she would answer, and mean it. The household adjusted to its new mistress with surprising ease. Teresa continued to rule the kitchen, but now with Rosalinda's blessing rather than in spite of her presence. They cooked together some mornings, trading recipes and stories while the sun climbed over the mountains. The other servants whispered that it was unseemly for a duchess to flour her own hands, but Rosalinda paid them no mind. Alexander, too, was transforming. The man who had hidden in shadows now walked openly through his estate, inspecting fields he had neglected, speaking with tenants he had ignored for years. The village needs a new well, he announced one evening. The old one has been failing for months. And what will you do? Fund the construction. Oversee it myself. He met her eyes with determination. I have ignored my responsibilities for too long. The well was completed within 2 months. Alexander attended the dedication, speaking few words but offering them with sincerity. The applause that followed was genuine, and Rosalinda watched from the crowd, her heart swelling with pride. Summer ripened into autumn, and with it came unexpected news. Rosalinda had been feeling unwell for weeks, a persistent nausea each morning, a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. It was Teresa who finally spoke the truth. You are with child. Do not argue. I have seen this too many times to be mistaken. Rosalinda stared at her, the words refusing to assemble into meaning. A child. Alexander's child. How do I tell him? She whispered. After the daughters he lost. How do I tell him he will be a father again? You tell him with love, Teresa said, and you trust that he is strong enough to bear the joy. She waited 3 days to be certain, visiting the village physician for confirmation. The child would come in late spring. She found Alexander in the library and closed the door behind her, hands trembling. I need to tell you something. His smile faded. What is it? Are you ill? I am not ill. She met his amber eyes. I am pregnant. Silence. Alexander's face went through shock, disbelief, fear, and something else she could not name. His legs gave way, and he sank into the nearest chair, pulling her into his lap. A child, he whispered against her hair. Our child. I know this must be terrifying. After Sophia and Nina and Beatrice. It is terrifying. His voice was raw, but it is also the most miraculous thing anyone has ever given me. He kissed her, deep and desperate. I am grateful, he said, terrified and grateful, and so full of love, I do not know how to contain it. Then we'll be terrified together. And whatever comes, we will face it together. Winter came early, blanketing the estate in snow. Rosalinda's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Alexander became a different kind of man, constantly attentive, tender in ways he had forgotten he could be. But some nights, the old grief still found him. Rosalinda woke one December evening to find the bed empty. She found Alexander in the nursery, a room being restored under his supervision, holding a small wooden horse that had belonged to Beatrice. She would have been 9 now, he said without turning, old enough to ride alone. Rosalinda moved beside him. She would have loved being a big sister. He turned, surprise in his eyes. You think so? From everything you have told me, Beatrice had a generous heart. Our child will grow up knowing their sisters, knowing Isabel. She squeezed his hand. We do not honor the dead by refusing to live. We honor them by carrying their love forward. They stood together as snow fell outside, surrounded by the ghosts of children lost and the promise of a child to come. Together, spring arrived with the force of a promise kept. The snow melted from the gardens, revealing green shoots pushing through dark earth. The roses Alexander and Rosalinda had planted together were budding again, their stems thick with the promise of blooms to come. And Rosalinda's belly had grown round and heavy, the child within making its presence known through kicks and movements that left her breathless. Impatient, she said one morning, pressing her hand to her side where a tiny foot had just struck. Like their father, Alexander looked up from his book, a smile crossing his features. I prefer to call it determination. You would. The household had been preparing for weeks. Teresa had taken command of the preparations with military precision, ensuring that linens were washed, the nursery was stocked, and the physician was on constant alert. Alonso had personally inspected every room for drafts or hazards. Even the gardener had contributed, planting lavender beneath the nursery windows because, he claimed, the scent would help the child sleep. But beneath the excitement, fear hummed like a constant undertone. Rosalinda saw it in the way Alexander watched her, tracking her movements, tensing whenever she winced, finding excuses to remain nearby even when his state business demanded his attention elsewhere. She understood. The last time he had awaited a child's birth, he had been a different man, living a different life, and that life had ended in flames. You cannot protect me from everything, she told him one evening as they walked through the gardens. Birth is dangerous. We both know this. I know. His jaw tightened. But knowing does not make the fear easier to bear. Then let me bear some of it. She stopped and turned to face him, taking his hands. I am not fragile, Alexander. I survived poverty and grief long before I met you. I will survive this too. And if something goes wrong, then we will face it together, as we have faced everything else. He pulled her close as her swollen belly would allow, and pressed his forehead to hers. I cannot lose you, he whispered. I would not survive it. You would, because that is what we do, we survive. But you will not have to. She kissed him softly. I am not going anywhere. The pains began 3 weeks later, on a night when rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across the mountains. Rosalinda had been restless all day, unable to find a comfortable position, her back aching with a persistence that no amount of rest could ease. She had dismissed it as the normal discomforts of late pregnancy, until the first true contraction seized her, so powerful that it stole her breath. Alexander, she gasped. He was at her side in an instant, his face pale. It is time. It is time. What followed was a blur of activity and pain. Teresa appeared with hot water and clean linens. Doctora Vega arrived within the hour, her calm presence a counterweight to the chaos. The maids hovered in doorways, dismissed repeatedly, but unable to stay away. And Alexander refused to leave. It is not proper, Doctora Vega said, attempting to usher him from the room. The birthing chamber is no place for a husband. I do not care about proper. His voice was steel. I was not there when my first wife needed me. I will not make that mistake again. Rosalinda, between contractions, reached for his hand. Let him stay. The hours stretched into eternity. Pain became Rosalinda's entire world. Waves of it, cresting and receding, each one stronger than the last. She gripped Alexander's hand until her knuckles whitened, and he bore it without complaint, murmuring encouragements she could barely hear through the haze. "You're doing beautifully," Dr. Vega said. "The child is coming. Just a little more." A little more became an age. Rosalinda pushed until she had no strength left, then found more strength somewhere within her. The same determination that had carried her through poverty, through grief, through the long journey that had led her to this moment. And then, finally, a cry, thin and high and furious, the sound of a new life announcing itself to the world. "A son," Dr. Vega declared, lifting the squalling infant. "Healthy and strong." Rosalinda collapsed against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the tiny creature in the physician's arms as though he had never seen anything so terrifying or beautiful. "A son," he repeated, his voice breaking. Dr. Vega cleaned the child and wrapped him in soft linen before placing him in Rosalinda's arms. He was small and red-faced, his eyes screwed shut, his fists waving with indignation at being forced from his warm haven. He was perfect. "Hello," Rosalinda whispered, touching his cheek with one trembling finger. "Hello, little one." Alexander sank onto the bed beside her, his eyes fixed on the child. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, and the baby's tiny hand closed around his finger. Something shattered in Alexander's expression, not breaking, but releasing, years of grief and fear finally finding their way out. Tears fell freely down his scarred face as he looked at his son, at his wife, at the impossible miracle they had created together. "I never thought," he could not finish. There were no words for this, for the magnitude of what he was feeling. "I know," Rosalinda said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Neither did I." They remained there as the storm outside finally quieted, as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the rain-washed windows. A new day, a new life, a new beginning. "What shall we call him?" Alexander asked eventually, his voice hoarse from emotion. Rosalinda looked at the child, their child, and knew the answer without hesitation. "Miguel," she said, "for my father." Alexander nodded slowly. "Miguel Alexander Mendoza, future Duke of Valderas." He paused, then added softly, "Brother to Sofia, Nina, and Beatrice. They would have adored him. They do adore him." Rosalinda kissed the baby's forehead. "Wherever they are, they're watching over him." The door cracked open, and Teresa's face appeared, eager and anxious. "May we see him?" Rosalinda smiled. "Come in, all of you." The household staff filed in with reverent silence, gathering around the bed to glimpse the heir they had been awaiting. Teresa wept openly. Alonso bowed to the infant with formal gravity. The maids cooed and whispered, debating whose eyes he had, whose nose. And Alexander sat amid it all, his arm around Rosalinda, his son cradled between them, looking for all the world like a man who had finally found his way home. The years that followed wrote themselves in moments of quiet joy. Miguel grew from a squalling infant into a curious toddler, then into a bright-eyed boy who inherited his mother's determination and his father's intensity. He ran through the gardens that Rosalinda and Alexander had restored together, chasing butterflies and picking roses that he presented to Teresa with solemn ceremony. He learned to ride before he learned to read, sitting before his father on horseback, laughing with delight as they galloped across fields that had once lain fallow with neglect. 2 years after Miguel's birth, a daughter arrived, Elena, with her father's amber eyes and her mother's dark curls. She was quieter than her brother, content to sit in Rosalinda's lap while stories were read, her small fingers tracing the illustrations in books that had once belonged to sisters she would never meet. Alexander hung their portraits in the nursery, Sofia, Nina, Beatrice, and told his new children about the siblings who watched over them from heaven. It was Rosalinda who had suggested it, who had insisted that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past did not diminish the present. "They would have loved you," Alexander told Miguel and Elena often, his voice steady now where once it would have broken. "And you would have loved them." The estate flourished under their joint stewardship. Alexander managed the lands and tenants with renewed purpose, while Rosalinda, The Duchess, who still preferred the kitchen to the drawing room, established a school in the village for children who otherwise would never learn to read. She taught there herself some days, standing before a classroom of wide-eyed students, showing them that circumstances of birth need not determine the course of a life. The Duchess who teaches peasants, some nobles sneered. The Duchess who changes futures, others whispered with grudging respect. Rosalinda cared nothing for either opinion. She had not married Alexander for a title, and she would not let a title define her now. Teresa aged, but refused to retire, claiming the kitchen would collapse without her supervision. Alonso trained a successor, but remained at his post, his loyalty to the family unshakable. The household that had once served a haunted man now served a thriving family, and they did so with pride. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Alexander led Rosalinda to the chapel at sunset. It had become their tradition, returning to this place of memory and promise, of endings and beginnings. The stained glass glowed with amber light, and roses from their garden adorned the altar, their fragrance filling the sacred space. 10 years, Alexander said, taking her hands. A decade since you walked through my door and refused to leave. You tried very hard to make me leave, as I recall. I was a fool. He lifted her hands to his lips. The greatest fool in all of Spain, perhaps. Perhaps. She smiled. But you improved. They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the colors of the fading sun. Through the open door, they could hear Miguel and Elena playing in the garden, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze, mingling with birdsong and the rustle of leaves. I think of them still, Alexander said quietly. Isabel, the girls, not every moment as I once did, but they're always there, woven into the fabric of who I am. As they should be. I used to believe that loving again meant betraying them. That happiness was a door I had closed forever. He turned to face her, and his amber eyes held nothing but peace. You taught me otherwise. You taught me that the heart expands rather than replaces, that I could love you fully while still loving them. Rosalinda touched his cheek, the scarred side, the side he had once hidden from the world. And you taught me that survival is not merely endurance, that it is possible to build something beautiful from ashes, to find purpose in pain, to choose hope when despair would be easier. She rose on her toes and kissed him softly. We saved each other, Alexander. We did. Miguel burst through the chapel door, Elena toddling behind him. Mama, Papa, Teresa says dinner is ready, and if we are late, she will feed our portions to the dogs. Alexander laughed, a full, warm sound that echoed off the ancient stones. He scooped Elena into his arms while Miguel grabbed Rosalinda's hand, tugging her toward the door. We must not keep Teresa waiting, Rosalinda said, her eyes bright with amusement. They walked together through the garden as the last light faded. A family forged not from perfect circumstances, but from courage, persistence, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to darkness. The roses bloomed around them, red and pink and white, their petals soft as promises. Behind them, the chapel bells began to ring, not for ceremony, but simply because the bell ringer felt that such an evening deserved music. And ahead, in the great house that had once been a mausoleum for grief, candles were being lit in every window. Teresa was setting the table. The children were laughing. Life was continuing, as it always did, carrying forward the love of those who remained and those who had gone before. Rosalinda paused at the garden gate and looked back at the path they had traveled. From the dark day she had arrived seeking only employment, to this moment of profound contentment. What are you thinking? Alexander asked. That I came here expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. She turned to him, to their children, to the life they had built against all odds. And I found everything. Alexander smiled, the smile that had taken years to reclaim, that she had fought to resurrect from the ashes of his despair. As did I, my love. As did I. They entered their home together, the door closing softly behind them, leaving only the roses and the evening stars as witnesses to the truth they had discovered. That love, like fire, could destroy, but it could also illuminate. That grief, like winter, would always pass, and spring would always return. And that two broken people, given courage and time, could mend each other into something stronger than either had been alone.